IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy, where we discuss policy issues of importance. I'm Priyal, and today with me I have Ritul, who is my colleague at the Takshashila Institution. Welcome to this podcast, Ritul. Happy to have you here. So today we are going to talk about the work of Elinor Ostrom and the co-design principles that she had come up with. So getting in straight to the topic, Ritul, can you start with telling the audience about who Elinor Ostrom is and what her work necessarily entailed?
Thank you for the introduction, Priyal. Today we are going to talk about a very interesting woman, and she perhaps happens to be the first economist Nobel laureate, Elinor Ostrom, for her work on designing the 8 core design principles for community functioning. Dr. Ostrom won the world's most prestigious award in economics, and at the time that she won, many were caught unaware. Never trained as an economist, Dr. Ostrom was in fact technically a political scientist. And beginning in the 1960s, Dr. Ostrom traveled across the Los Angeles water basin and the American Midwest through Swiss pastures and into the villages of South Asia, Nepal, to gather evidence for a theory that very few of her contemporaries believed into. Born in 1933, Elinor Ostrom's perspective of the world was shaped in an era impacted by economic depression and global war, resulting in a lifelong deep awareness of limited natures of Earth's natural resources, as well as the capacity of the community to come together in times of difficulty, to cooperate and provide a helping hand to those. These beliefs were powerful in shaping a career of path-breaking research that demonstrated the importance of collective actions for the sustainable use of natural resources. So it was through her upbringings that she sort of based her principles, which then shaped the rest of her works. And in a sense, Dr. Ostrom contended that individual and communities could effectively manage their own collective resources, essentially involving fisheries, forest, and water supply without the intrusion of government regulation and or private industry. Now, why does Ostrom's work become all the more important? Is it was antithetical to the two more prominent ideas, one being tragedy of commons, and two was either to privatize the property or the all-encompassing government takes over the land. In fact, in an interesting talk at Indianapolis, Dr. Ostrom says, little by little, bit by bit, family by family, so much good can be done by so many levels.
Right.
So Priyal, would you wanna explain tragedy of commons to our listeners so that they have a better idea of what she was actually critiquing?
Yeah, definitely. Actually, so tragedy of commons was a concept that was published in the reputed journal Science, as many people know, by ecologist Garrett Hardin in 1968. So it sort of reveals a fundamental truth of human nature, and it also had a huge impact on public policy. And one of the reasons why it spoke so much to many people is because at the time when he published it, and because it's cited, I think, nearly 13,000 or 30,000 times, that's a lot of citations for an article that was published, right? And I think it's one of the highest, largely cited articles in the current times. So, and the reason why it speaks so much to so many people is because Hardin wasn't necessarily making a technical argument, but rather a very moral one. And in one of the excerpt from his article, it also says that he asked you to picture a pasture which is open to all, and it is expected that each herdsman will try to keep as many cattle as possible on the commons because it's a common space. Now, such an arrangement will work satisfactorily for multiple centuries because there are situations like tribal wars, there's poaching, and also disease that keeps the number of both the men, the herdsmen, as well as the cattle well below the carrying capacity of the land. Now, finally, imagine a day comes where we achieve the utopian goal of social stability. And at this point, this inherent logic of the commons becomes slowly transformed into a tragedy. So what happens is now the rational herdsman knows that, the only sensible way for him to pursue is to add another animal to the herd. And they keep adding that multiple animals to the herd, right? So by this conclusion, if this logic is applied by every single herdsman and who shares that common space, then comes the tragedy part, because each man is kind of locked in a system that sort of forces him or compels him to increase his herd without any limit. And because there is no limit to the number of cattle he adds, but the pasture that is there, that is limited. So there is unlimited people competing for a limited resource. Now, and each person thinks for himself very selfishly, with a very selfish motive, keeping only his best interest in mind. So basically, the freedom in a commons brings sort of like ruins to all. So when Hardin was talking about common pooled resources, so when he was talking about commons, right, he was basically talking about common pool resources. And these common pool resources are basically, forest, pastures, fisheries, basically something that are publicly accessible, but also finite and therefore very vulnerable to depletion. Now, according to like Hardin's logic, which is the basis of the conventional economic wisdom, the only way to prevent the tragedy of commons is the two binaries that you told about previously, right? One is to either privatize the resource or use whenever possible, or for the states to sort of impose like a top down regulation. And Hardin himself favored the top down regulation of resources. Now, what Elinor basically did was basically critique that sort of thing. And I think, Ritul, I think you should talk about like I think you're the best person to talk about where she critiqued and what her input on that particular thing was.
Thank you, Priyal, for explaining what tragedy of commons meant. Uh, few thinking points here. One being that any idea that is predominantly put out there is also a product of our times. Elinor Ostrom's work was based on the times that she saw starvation, she saw deprivation, and in those times, cooperation was one basic element that she saw around. Same for, in fact, it goes back to Lockean times. Locke saw a very good side of human nature, wherein other philosophers did not see such good side of human nature. So I don't know what phase Hardin was per se born in and what sort of society he grew up in. So that sort of predominantly explains in the kind of work that they do. Now, to think about tragedy of commons, I think the power in the idea is that it is a very plain, simple idea of human nature, explanation of human nature, and any idea which is easily conceivable because I mean, humans are difficult to explain with all the multitudes. But if you get a simple idea of it, it's easily graspable, and it can be sort of explained it to the masses. So I think one of the reasons of the popularity of idea could be that. But Ostrom was a vehement critic of it. She took a more altruistic view of human nature. She did not believe that top-down control can work, and she felt that the government lacked key capabilities. And I think it is right in most sense, because can you imagine a police person, or let's say a forest protection regime, being able to patrol the entire forest? It is just not possible, because one cop with a gun cannot fence around the entire area. So the government lacks the capacity in order to enforce all the rules that it can make from the top. So it is very hard for top-down regulators to know the exact capacity of a resource, to monitor it, and appropriately respond to infractions. And also, this arrangement sort of falls on its face because it is inefficient because of the controller is outside the system. So they don't have direct stakeholdership in the rules and regulations that are being made. And invariably, what will happen in this case is that there will be a disenchantment in the communities that these rules are being set. So Ostrom believed, one, in the altruistic nature of human beings. She believed that humans can govern among themselves. And this idea also sort of relates to what Gandhi did. He had the difference between moderates and extremists was that moderates believed that the masses are not ready for, let's say, cultural revolution. The extremists were anyway so extreme that they knew that masses cannot fight on the roads. Gandhi came with a completely different ideology. He believed in the masses. He believed in the capacity of the masses to sort of understand that big idea of a freedom. And similarly for Ostrom, she believed in the capacity of these people, of communities, that they can sort of cooperate. And same for privatization. Private market only works when the owner actually cares about it.
Yeah.
But if the intention of the owner is to exploit the resource as rapidly as possible, which we see in mines,
Sorry.
they want to extract as much resource, as much natural resource as they want and they can, and then they go on exploiting to the next mine.
Correct.
So if that is the case, then it does very little help to what your resource is. So Ostrom argued that we should not be drawn to the simplicity of either of the two ideas, but instead take on a difficult context-bound work of designing approaches in which those people who are most affected by it can make binding agreements to commit themselves to cooperate. So Priyal, would you want to actually talk about what this common pool resource is, that what Dr. Ostrom talks about that is being governed in this case?
Right, yeah. So, like you said, right, she believed in the common good of people a lot and stuff. And so she actually studied the problem extremely comprehensively, including sort of like reviewing the common pool resources groups. I think when she was talking about common pool resources, she was also talking about communities managing different tangible resources that we talk about, right? For us, and because if you see a lot of her work and the way people have reviewed her work and people have taken out some of the things from her work, you will see that a lot of it has to do with managing resources such as like lakes and forests and community resources which are tangible. And she also talks about like how when you're managing so when she was reviewing these common pool resource groups in sort of like the traditional settings as well as like the industrial societies around the world, she sort of concluded that the groups that are able to manage and also sort of sustainably share their common pool resources without the need for privatization or top-down regulation, they need to enact certain sort of like design principles. They need to have like certain principles in place to avoid the tragedy of commons that Hardin had talked about. And that is what actually led her in getting the Nobel Prize as the first woman in economics.
Exactly. She studied these groups and then she codified the principle that what works. And on the basis of that, she developed this framework, which actually says that these are the certain design principles that will forestall the tragedy of overuse and other failures of cooperation. So her studies throughout the group said that these 8 basic principles,
Right,
which will vary in personal capacity. The application of it will be altered and varied, but these 8 principles are something that is drawn from them and it could be replicated in future.
Yeah. Actually, you know what, Ritul, let's move on further and talk about these 8 principles. But before we go there, let's take a short break and we will be right back.
Hello. It's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Shunya One, Sheila Ditya asks co-founder Kanika Agarwal and Atanu Agarwal about how Upside AI came to be. On Cider Says His Cock and Bull, Puneet Ayushi and Abbas discuss how a bride refused to marry a bald groom. On Press Decode, Sarah Vagda and Prafula debate over the ongoing Mandir Masjid mania in the country. On Postcards from Nowhere, Utsav tells us about how nature and history have shaped Rajasthani food. And on All Things Policy, the Takshashila folk discuss the worker shortage in fast food delivery companies. We've got some exciting news for you. IVM Podcast has launched merchandise and our first line is out now. Head to the IVM Podcast website and click on the shop tab and check out the first collection of t-shirts. Do follow us on social media as well. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Also, don't forget to rate us on any of the platforms you're listening to us on, whether it's Spotify, whether it's Apple, wherever you do that, that is really helpful for us. And do remember, you can also check a lot of our shows out on YouTube. If you go to ivmpodcast.com/YouTube, you get a list of all of our channels. We're also doing a small listener survey, so please do help us out with that. If you go to ivmpodcast.com/survey, it'll help us understand a little bit more about our listeners. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, SBI Life Insurance, Jupiter, a digital banking app, and Capgemini. Get the future you want. Thank you so much. Without you guys, this wouldn't be possible.
Welcome back to the ATP podcast. We were discussing Elinor Ostrom and her 8 core design principles. Priyal, why don't you take us to these 8 principles now so that we have a better understanding of what she has studied from these groups?
Yeah, like you mentioned previously, right? She studied various communities and she monitored them to a point wherein she studied, I think, thousands of communities and then put up like a framework and then came up with these like 8 principles, which sort of talk about how these groups manage amongst themselves to sort of take care of these common pool resources. And some of the points, I think she came up with 8, so I will take you through all of them. So one of the first things she said that the groups that functioned really well had very clearly defined boundaries, and which means that what she means when she talks about boundaries is that they know that they are a group and what that group is about and who is a member of that particular group. They have very clearly defined boundaries for it. And also after which she also said that they also had rules that are adapted to local conditions and sort of like which ensured that the group members that have equivalence when it comes to the cost as well as benefits. And everyone in the group also has their collective choice arrangements so that whenever a decision is taken, everyone is affected by the decision has an opportunity to contribute into making that decision. That was the third principle that she came up with. So, there is like, if you think about it, she's mapped out the proper stakeholder people there. People who have stake in it have the equal sort of opportunity to have a say in everything that is being done in the group. Now, there's also something called as, she also says that these groups who function very closely, they also have something called as mod, which means whenever there are you previously agree upon certain behaviors, right? And if there is a lapse in those particular behaviors, these behaviors can be detected. And this was basically done within the communities rather than having an external authority come and sort of reprimand them for their behavior. So basically, like a peer reviewed kind of thing, right? There is no power imbalance of sort there. And there were also she also said that the fifth principle that she talked about is that there were graduated sanctions. So what I mean by that is that when these agreed upon behaviors were lapsed and they were corrected, they were first corrected very gently, but they had the capacity to escalate whenever necessary, if and when necessary. And also these groups that function really well also had something called as a conflict resolution mechanism that sort of made sure that these differences that arose in the group, because if it's a group, obviously there is going to be some differences, some conflict that is going to come up. And every single time that happens, there is a mechanism to recognize these and to solve these conflicts before they get out of hand. The seventh principle that she laid out was that everybody has a minimum sort of recognition of the rights to organize, which means that it gave the member of the group the authority to manage their own affairs without interference from any external authority, which is completely sort of opposite to a top-down regulation, right? Because like you mentioned before, in a top-down regulation, what happens is a lot of times there is no stake, that they don't have a stake in that particular thing. Here, because you have a stake in it, and you also have the minimum rights sort of required to be in that group and to function in a group, you're sort of making sure that things happen very smoothly. Now, for the eighth principle, what she did was the first 7 principles talk about a smaller group, right? But when these small groups to coalesce together and form like a bigger group, they form something called as the polycentric governance. And basically, polycentric meaning like multiple centered governance. So when groups of groups in multiple layers, they become sort of like nested enterprises. Now, each subgroup that comes under this bigger group, they relate to other groups from all of these previous principles that she has laid down. So all of these together, she put together form the core design principles that Elinor had put up. And we know for a fact that if you look at any well-functioning group for that matter, if you sort of understand or try to see how they function, you will see that every group has some unknowingly or knowingly has these core principles in place, which is why the group sort of functions so really, really, really well. And I think what we need at this point is to understand if we can sort of apply these principles into problems that are currently there, or if these these principles of grouping has been used in solving certain problems that are currently existing in the country or in the world, in the public domain or whatever, right? So, Ritul, can you take us through like some of the examples that are in place that sort of shows that these core design principles that she came up with have been applied and to form groups that sort of where she talks about community driven approach towards solving a problem and managing resources.
Thank you, Priyal. And as a matter of fact, this was just the exact thought that was going in my head. Like when you said that the application of it, or just that, can we think of it in Indian context or contextual terms, contemporary contextual terms? As a matter of fact, I stumbled upon this IUCN paper which was on Ostrom's work, and then there was this chapter on Ostrom's contribution, Ostrom's research in India, and you'd be happy and both surprised to know that all of what she's said, all of her work that she's discussed has been extensively at play in India.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, one of the to begin with, India has a lot of common pool resources.
Yeah.
1/5 of our land, this is according to the Indian Forest Report, 1/5 of our land is a common pool resources, roughly around 45 to 60 million hectares. And in under these areas, what she studied was that communities that have strong previous traditions tend to be non-exploitative towards each other. Communities that have shared understanding, shared ideas, shared origins tend to be non-exploitative towards the common resources. And again, as the previous idea that I mentioned earlier, for government, it is difficult to monitor these common pool resources because they're extensive, they're huge. And in that case, communities that step on their own, they take care of their own communities, which is not new, by the way. They've been doing it for thousands of years. As a matter of fact, Sacred Grove is recognized by the government,
Right.
which is a sort of forest which is devoted to a deity, and the local villagers protect and have customs and norms around it. In fact, throughout, and this is an interesting point, studied throughout Maharashtra, which included Maharashtra, Nepal, and Jharkhand, which included major forests like Tadoban, Dhari, Chitwan in Nepal, concluded that official designation, whatever the government designates in terms of if it is a government forest, if it is a community forest, if it is a joint forest resource, etc., does not matter.
Oh, okay.
What actually matters instead is that do they have a significant involvement in rule formation and monitoring?
Okay.
And very interesting, it goes back to her principle.
I see.
Yeah. So do they have because they were collective choice agreements that everybody is affected by a decision and they have a stakeholdership in that. So do they have do they have a stake in sort of rule making and at the same time monitoring? They don't want somebody else to be monitoring.
They don't want an external.
Yeah. But what is heartening to see now is that the government is making note of it, and not just from today, but it's been a while. The Scheduled Tribes and Traditional Forest Dwellers Act, which is the Forest Right Act 2006, takes this into account. They takes the traditional rights of forest dwellers into account. They give them governance control. They give them rule formation, monitoring, etc. controls. But there are various nuances to it, which we will get to later, that are the communities capable enough to manage these shared resources. But there was also this interesting argument which was made that what if the access to market or commercialization has affected and corrupted local people's behavior, have corrupted these local. But throughout her work, extensively in Maharashtra and other Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Jharkhand, forest-rich areas, she concluded that communities that have strong traditions of shared norms and mutual trust tend to be more cooperative, tend to take care of that resource. So they are away, which is what the tragedy of commons argument is.
The profit is not the factor here because their notion that protection of this particular thing is more important than the profit. Right.
Yeah, exactly. So coming back to the government has been making effort. There's no denying the government understands that this idea is important. The government understands that this is a model that can be replicated to protect India's common resources. Because also, Priyal, what you have to understand here is that common resources are essentially being used by underprivileged folks,
Right.
because
Right.
someone who can afford can get a water pipeline
Yeah.
to his farm.
Definitely.
Someone who can afford does have a house, does have a tree. Because when people go out for when people take their cattle for grazing, when people use these common bathing, etc., so many areas, it is not the most affluent one. So to protect them has to be a priority. And where does it come from? Because you can't tax, and so it has to come essentially from the people among themselves. So the government has been making joint forest management, forest rights act. They are steps in the right direction. In fact, state governments and high courts have taken initiatives. They formed ADR, alternative dispute resolution mechanisms, where land disputes regarding who owns and who controls are often disposed quickly at a micro level instead of it going to the higher levels. But what I'm really interested into it is now that how does her idea play into the urban commons?
Right.
Because in the instances that we talked about, these shared community, shared idea, involvement in peer monitoring, etc., all of this is extremely favorable in the case of a rural setting.
Okay.
Yeah. How do you put it in an urban setting where everyone's a migrant?
Yeah.
People do not have allegiance to the law of the land. People do not have stakeholdership in land. So I'm really interested to see Ostrom's idea. And as a matter of fact, it's not just me. Ostrom herself was interested into letting her idea play into the urban commons.
Right.
In fact, she studied Bangalore as an example.
Okay.
So one of their studies found that out of the 7 lakes that were being monitored in the city, 5 of them had communities working towards its protection along with the government.
Right.
So this was more of a polycentric model.
Yeah.
So bunch of communities sort of trying to protect the lake, whereas there was also the overarching government, which was sort of facilitating that, but everyone had a shared goal, which was protection of these lakes. So the 5 lakes that both the government and the communities were working were better protected.
Yeah.
It had lesser pollution, and they were sort of on a path to recovery. Whereas the 2 just under the ambit of the government were sort of on a decline. So this is an interesting observation which I feel. Now, I think moving slightly a level up, that how can we use Ostrom's principles in sort of addressing the challenges of our times?
Right.
So few things that strike my mind is, one is that the challenges are humongous now.
Right.
In order to let Ostrom's idea of commons governing common pool resources to work. One being, on the top of my head, I could think of 3. One is, we are massively heterogeneous now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's too much diversity in place.
So, and then once the conflict of interest is at play, who wants what, plus let's say migrants or the freeloaders do not even have stakeholdership. So how do you get them to actually sort of work for this? One being that. 2, the rules that these communities that are working upon, what if they are inequitable? What if these rules, let's say they're protecting even the lake or the community forest grove properly, but what if the internal governing system of it is very much antithetical to the Constitution of India? Yeah. So what if these rules that are being made from these communities, what if they're rooted in the caste system?
Yeah.
What if so there are a lot of probables which might say that what if these are inequitable?
Right.
And third is slightly narcissistic, but we have I think we also have massive amounts of freedom in our public spaces. So because it's not closed or gated in any sense, I mean, look at our railway stations. Because the entry exit is open from all ends, nobody protects it. Nobody has any stakeholdership in it. So but then once you close it, it sort of
Again, there's a whole new set of laws.
Yeah, it goes against the very idea of free society or liberalism. So these are the things that I can think of, but I'm certain that we need to think, because some of the good things is that Ostrom takes an altruistic view of human nature.
Yeah.
She has codified the principles. So with these things in mind, we need to think at contemporary challenges and figure out how we can replicate it and sort of build a future. Because I still think this is, although rooted in the past, this is an evolutionary idea.
Right.
This is an evolutionary idea. Because the past has also sort of corrupted us with a narrow view of human nature, wherein everybody sort of yeah, and and particularly what's also critical here is the times that we live in.
Yeah.
As climate change advances, we would need more human cooperation. And how do we do it? How do we sort of build frameworks and principles that humans can cooperate, work for, protect resources? I think we would need to keep going back to Ostroms and how we can replicate it. These are fairly my thoughts. Do you have anything to add?
No. So, like, whatever you said, actually, like, that was very comprehensive and very detailed and stuff, right? So, like, I understand because you were talking about the free movement, but when we talk about it, we're also talking about how it goes against the idea of liberalism and stuff. But especially like at a time when climate change is something that we are battling so heavily, and to know that, because these are the communities, especially when we involve in like government community partnerships and stuff, there's so much of traditional knowledge system also that comes with it, that because they're so involved in that process, they know so many things that people outside would not know. For example, like for me as a person who studied biology, if I go to a forest area and say that based on because plant biology says this is exactly how you need to do. But if the people who've lived there, who know the practices, come and so there needs to be a proper exchange of knowledge, and that can happen when you involve these communities as important decision makers and involved in the decision making process. So, like you said, right, we need to apply Ostrom's principles that were designed at that point to the contemporary problems and help come up with possible solutions that can help us solve multiple problems. So,
True. I think I would want to end on a simple note that the power in an idea is just how simple it is.
right.
It's no secret.
Yeah.
It's out there. Everyone sort of, the communities that function well know it. They're peer reviewed. They've made the rules themselves. They know it well. So I think definitely worth thinking and worth replicating a lot of it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm just going to end with her own quote, which we said it in the beginning. Little by little, bit by bit, family by family, so much good can be done on so many levels.
Definitely. Thank you for that, peak that you took us through. Thank you so much, Ritul, for having this conversation with me.
My pleasure.
I feel this was really important to talk about because a lot of times when we talk about public policy issues that need to be addressed, I think going back and knowing the basis of certain things and having some idea about the past and the knowledge systems and everything plays a very important role in forming solutions, right? And Eleanor's principles is extremely important for us, especially as we as people who work on the public policy space. So thank you so much.
To close this, I would recommend to our listeners that they can watch her lectures. One of Indiana Police School has one. Marginal Revolution has a video explaining. And then she has also written a book. And then The Harbinger of Change, Social is also one of them.
Yeah.
So these are the few resources that we recommend.
Definitely. And we will add it our, the blurb that we write so that people can access it. So yeah, thank you so much for listening to us, and we will see you in the next episode. Bye-bye.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
There's a quick survey to fill out on ivmpodcast.com/survey. It lets us know a little bit more about who's listening to us. And you know what? We're going to do a few prizes. So, we'll do a random drawing of maybe 10 people and we'll send you all some swag. Remember, that's ivmpodcast.com/survey where you can fill out the survey.
Ladies, I'm sure you will relate to it if I say that we are constantly busy with work, studies, cooking, and what not. And amidst all of this, we often forget an important element that needs our desperate attention: finance. So here we are, bringing to you SBI Life presents A Sip of Finance, a women-exclusive podcast where we will teach you how to manage personal finances in a simple and straightforward way with your host, Priyanka Acharya, a finance expert who's been in the industry for 14 plus years. And not just in English, but in 7 more languages. So tune in every Tuesday for fresh episodes on the IVM Podcast Network and all major podcast streaming platforms.